Billionaire was lost without an interpreter until the cleaning lady revealed her hidden talent. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers that spilled golden light across polished marble floors. It wasn't just another evening. It was the kind of night that could shift power, seal billion-dollar contracts, and rewrite destinies. Every whisper, every handshake, every glass raised in toast carried weight. And yet, in the center of it all, stood Alexander Pierce, a man known across continents as ruthless, brilliant, untouchable. The billionaire who had turned steel, oil, and shipping into empires. The man whispered with both envy and fear. But tonight, for the first time in years, something unexpected gnawed at him. A table of executives from Japan waited patiently across the hall. The deal at hand was monumental, but the interpreter Alexander always relied on had been delayed. Without her, the fortress of his confidence had cracks. He had money, power, connections, but none of them could help him speak words he didn't understand. The hum of conversation grew louder. Every tick of the clock echoed in his chest. For the first time in decades, Alexander Pierce felt something he had almost forgotten: helplessness. And standing only a few steps away, dressed in a plain uniform with rubber gloves tucked in her apron, was the last person anyone expected to matter that night. Rosa Delgado, the cleaning lady. Quiet, invisible, blending into the background as she polished silver trays and picked up half-empty champagne flutes left behind by careless guests. But Rosa's eyes held a depth no one noticed. They carried stories, secrets, and a sharpness that had been buried beneath years of silence. And tonight, fate was about to call her name. Before we go deeper, let me pause and say hello to my friends. Where are you watching from tonight? I love seeing the countries and cities you represent in the comments. It makes our storytelling family feel alive and connected. And if you're new here, welcome to Unbroken Truths. If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more stories like these. Stories that heal, inspire, and remind us that worth often hides where the world least expects it. Now, let's return to that ballroom, to the billionaire who thought he had everything, and to the cleaning lady who was about to change his world forever. The ballroom sparkled, but behind the shimmer and clinking glasses, two very different worlds coexisted without ever touching. Alexander Pierce was a man who belonged to the stage of kings. 6'2", broad-shouldered, his tailored tuxedo clinging to him like armor. His presence drew eyes even when he tried to disappear into the shadows. People spoke of his genius in turning collapsing industries into empires. But they also whispered about his heart, which they said was forged in ice, untouched by weakness. Yet beneath that polished exterior, Alexander carried something he never let the world see. He didn't talk about the sleepless nights, the betrayals that had carved scars into his trust, the way he avoided relationships that demanded vulnerability. Power was his language because it never betrayed him. But love, trust, those were foreign lands he had locked away long ago. And Rosa Delgado was the opposite of everything he represented. Rosa had been working at the Grand Monarch Hotel for nearly 5 years. She wore the same navy blue uniform every night, her hair pulled back in a simple braid, her shoes worn thin from miles walked across marble and carpet. People barely noticed her. She was the shadow that moved silently between champagne glasses, the hand that cleared plates no one cared about once emptied. But what they didn't know was that Rosa had once dreamed in languages. Spanish had been her lullaby as a child, but she had grown up learning English, French, and Japanese in night classes while working 2 jobs to support her family. She had been the girl who could sit in a library for hours, losing herself in words she wanted to master, believing that someday those words would carry her to a better life. That dream, however, had been interrupted. Her father had fallen ill. Bills had swallowed her ambitions whole. And while her friends went on to university, Rosa picked up cleaning shifts, first part-time, then full-time, until her textbooks gathered dust in a corner. But she never let herself forget. Words still danced in her head when she worked. Japanese kanji scribbled on post-it notes tucked in her apron. French proverbs whispered under her breath when she swept empty corridors. Language wasn't just knowledge for Rosa. It was the one treasure she refused to surrender, even if no one ever knew she held it. Now fate was aligning 2 lives that should never have touched. Alexander, the billionaire feared by his rivals, was about to crumble without an interpreter. Rosa, the invisible cleaning lady, held the very skill that could save him. And in that collision, something more powerful than words themselves was about to spark admiration, tension, and the beginning of a story neither of them could control. But before we step into that fateful moment, let me ask you something, dear listener. If you were in Rosa's shoes, overlooked, underestimated, carrying a hidden gift no one cared to notice, would you reveal it? Would you risk stepping into the spotlight knowing it could change everything? Or would you stay silent, safe in the shadows? Tell me in the comments, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Because Rosa, she was about to make her choice. The international partners were already restless. The Japanese delegation whispered among themselves, brows furrowed, exchanging looks that made Alexander's chest tighten. He hated the feeling of this gnawing vulnerability clawing at his pride. For once, his billions couldn't shield him. The interpreter he had relied on was nowhere to be found. A last-minute cancellation, a logistical disaster. The kind of small oversight that should never happen to Alexander Pierce, the man who could buy and sell empires with a signature. Yet here he was stranded in a sea of unfamiliar words, helpless. He leaned forward, trying to catch even fragments of the rapid Japanese flowing across the table, but it was useless. Their language was precise, layered with nuance, and without guidance he risked insulting them with a single wrong word. He saw the opportunity slipping, the deal unraveling, and with it, the pride of being a man who never failed in public. Around the edges of the grand room, hotel staff hovered discreetly, servers carrying trays, cleaners ensuring no glass marred the floor, security guards watching silently. Rosa was among them, wiping down the polished railing near the back wall, her head bowed as always, invisible. But inside her, a storm raged. She could hear every word, every phrase the Japanese delegate spoke. Her mind pieced together the conversation with instinctive ease, and she could also hear Alexander's growing silence, the billionaire, usually quick with words, now trapped in a silence that reeked of defeat. Her heart hammered in her chest. This was her chance. The chance she had secretly dreamed of, but never believed would come. But should I? She thought, gripping the cloth in her hand so tightly her knuckles whitened. If she stepped forward, everything would change. The staff might resent her for overstepping. Management could punish her for embarrassing the hotel. And Alexander, what if he dismissed her? What if he humiliated her for daring to interrupt his business? But another thought pressed harder. What if she stayed silent? What if she let him fall? She had always promised herself she wouldn't hide her light forever, that someday her gift would matter. And maybe, just maybe, this was the moment fate had been preparing her for. She wiped her palms against her uniform and took a step forward. At first, no one noticed. She cleared her throat softly, then louder. Heads turned. The delegation stared, confused. Alexander's cold blue eyes narrowed, sharp with irritation at the interruption. "Excuse me," Rosa said, her voice trembling but steady enough to carry. "I can help." The silence that followed was crushing. The room seemed to pause, like the chandeliers themselves held their breath. Alexander's gaze pinned her where she stood. "Help? How exactly?" Rosa swallowed hard, then lifted her chin. "I speak Japanese. If you'll allow me, I can translate." The words landed like stones in still water, rippling across the table. The Japanese delegation raised their brows in surprise, their whispers filling the room again. Alexander leaned back slowly, studying her. His expression was unreadable, a mask of control, but behind his eyes was something sharper. Suspicion, curiosity, maybe even the faintest flicker of hope. He could dismiss her, mock her, send her scurrying back to the shadows where she belonged. That would be the easiest path. But something in Rosa's eyes stopped him. They were steady, determined, not the eyes of someone bluffing for attention. They held fire, and Alexander Pierce was a man who recognized fire. He gestured toward the empty chair beside him. "Fine. Prove it." Rosa inhaled sharply, walked forward, and took the seat she had never dreamed she would occupy beside the most powerful man in the room. She bowed slightly toward the Japanese delegates, her words flowing effortlessly in their native tongue. "I apologize. The interpreter could not be here, so I will serve in their place." The reaction was immediate. Their faces lit up in relief. Respect flickered in their eyes as one of them nodded, replying warmly. Rosa translated seamlessly, her voice calm, her tone precise, bridging the chasm between two worlds. And for the first time that evening, Alexander Pierce, the billionaire untouchable, looked at Rosa not as a maid, but as something more. A mystery. A woman who had just changed everything. The meeting resumed, but the air had shifted. Rosa's presence at the table drew every eye, her uniform stark against the polished suits and silk ties. She was supposed to be invisible, a shadow sweeping floors. Yet now, every time she spoke, the entire room leaned in, hanging on her words. Alexander folded his hands together, hiding the way his fingers drummed against his knee. He wasn't used to this, his spotlight being stolen, his control slipping into the hands of someone else. Worse, someone who worked for him. A cleaning lady. Yet he couldn't deny the results. Rosa moved with surprising composure. Her Japanese was fluid, flawless. She translated not just words but meaning, catching cultural nuances that even seasoned professionals sometimes missed. When the delegates spoke in layered metaphors, she carried the essence across effortlessly. When humor flickered in their tone, she delivered it with warmth that softened the tension in the room. At one point, the lead delegate cracked a subtle joke about businessmen who thought money could buy patience. The room chuckled politely. Rosa's lips curved into the faintest smile as she translated, her eyes flicking briefly toward Alexander, as if daring him to catch the barb. For the first time in years, Alexander felt heat rise to his face. He masked it quickly with a tight smile, but inside the flame of irritation licked at his pride. Still, admiration crept in alongside it. He studied her closely now, noting the steady rhythm of her voice, the way her dark eyes never wavered, the quiet authority she carried without flaunting it. He realized something startling. Rosa didn't just speak Japanese, she belonged in this space. She was commanding the room with a confidence that rivaled his own, and it unsettled him. Where had she been hiding this? He wondered, watching her hands move lightly as she emphasized a phrase. How long has she been walking my halls, sweeping my floors, while carrying this kind of brilliance inside her? The thought gnawed at him. Not because he disliked it, but because it forced him to confront something uncomfortable. How blind he had been. How many times had he passed her by without a second glance, assuming she was just another background figure in his empire? He hated realizing he'd underestimated someone so completely. When the meeting ended, the Japanese delegation stood, bowing with genuine respect. One of them even addressed Rosa directly, thanking her for her grace and precision. They handed her a small card as an acknowledgement, a mark of esteem. She accepted it with both hands, bowing politely, her cheeks tinged with pink. Alexander stood as well, his posture rigid, his expression carefully neutral. He shook hands with the delegates, watching Rosa from the corner of his eye. Every word of praise directed at her twisted like a knot in his chest. When the room finally emptied, leaving only the two of them, the silence was thick. Rosa shifted uncomfortably, clutching the card in her hand. She glanced at Alexander, half expecting rebuke. Instead, he spoke slowly, his voice low but sharp. "You've been hiding this." Rosa blinked, startled. "I wasn't hiding. No one ever asked." Her words cut deeper than she realized. Alexander stared at her, his jaw tightening. No one ever asked. He had built an empire on information, on knowing every detail of those around him. Yet somehow the person sweeping his floors had been a mystery right under his nose. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "Do you have any idea what you just did there? You saved a deal worth billions." Her lips parted, but she said nothing. "And you," he hesitated, his voice lowering into something softer, almost reluctant. "You impressed me." The admission surprised even him. Alexander Pierce didn't hand out compliments. He bought loyalty, demanded excellence, and expected results. But Rosa had given him all three without asking for anything in return. She lowered her gaze, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't trying to impress you. I just didn't want to see you fail." Something in her honesty struck him harder than any corporate betrayal ever had. For the first time in a very long time, Alexander Pierce felt small, human, and strangely grateful. He hated it, and he couldn't look away from her. The car ride back to the hotel was quiet, but not comfortable. Alexander sat rigidly in the back seat of the black sedan, his hands steepled under his chin. Rosa sat opposite him, eyes fixed out the window, her uniform still crisp despite the long day. The city lights streaked past, flashing against the glass like broken pieces of memory. He should have felt victorious. The deal hadn't collapsed. The Japanese delegation left satisfied. His empire was intact, but victory had never tasted so bitter. Every glance at Rosa reminded him of what he'd almost lost, and how it wasn't him who had saved the day. It was her. "You're wasting cleaning floors," he said, suddenly his voice cutting through the hum of the engine. Rosa turned her head, surprised. "Excuse me?" "You heard me." He shifted his gaze to her. "You have a gift, Rosa, a rare one, and all this time you've been polishing marble floors and emptying trash cans." His tone sharpened. "Why?" Her fingers tightened around the edge of her seat. She hesitated, as though weighing whether to speak the truth. Finally, she exhaled. "Because you never asked." The words landed like a slap. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Don't play games with me. Someone like you doesn't just end up scrubbing offices unless steno." He stopped, realizing how cruel the thought sounded, even before it was finished. "Unless you're nothing. Unless you don't belong anywhere else." Her jaw tightened. She turned back to the window, but her reflection in the glass was sharp, almost defiant. "You want to know why?" Her voice trembled, not with fear but with anger. "Because I learned the hard way that talent doesn't matter when you're the wrong color, from the wrong neighborhood, with the wrong last name." The car seemed to shrink around them. Alexander said nothing. His throat constricted as her words sliced open memories he had buried under years of steel and glass. Rosa's voice steadied as she continued. "I studied languages. I dreamed of becoming an interpreter. I was at the top of my class. But every door I knocked on slammed shut. And while I was trying to prove myself, my mother got sick. Someone had to pay the bills." She gave a bitter laugh. "So I traded my textbooks for a mop, and here I am." Silence filled the car again, heavy, suffocating. Alexander leaned back slowly, staring at her like he was seeing her for the first time, not as a servant, not as an employee, but as a person whose battles mirrored shadows of his own, because Alexander Pierce knew what it was to lose something that defined you. He had built his empire from the ashes of his father's failures. He knew the hunger of being dismissed, underestimated. He knew the humiliation of knocking on doors that never opened. But he had something Rosa didn't: wealth, power, the privilege of being given a second chance. And for the first time in his life, Alexander felt ashamed of the fortune he carried. The car pulled to a stop in front of the hotel. The driver opened the door, but neither of them moved. Finally, Rosa whispered, "You asked me why I've been cleaning floors. That's the answer. Not because I couldn't do more, but because the world wouldn't let me." Her voice cracked, raw with truth. Alexander turned his head toward her, his eyes unreadable. He should have dismissed her, reminded her that she was an employee, that personal stories had no place between them. But instead, he found himself asking the one question he had no right to ask. "What do you want, Rosa?" Her lips parted. She blinked, caught off guard. "What do I want?" "Yes." His voice softened, almost breaking. "Not what the world gave you, not what life forced on you. What do you want?" For a long moment she just looked at him, as if weighing whether this man, this billionaire who had once been blind to her, deserved her truth. Then quietly, almost too quietly to hear, she said, "I want my life back." The words hit Alexander like thunder, and in that instant something inside him shifted. It wasn't a pity. It wasn't guilt. It was recognition. Because somewhere deep in the recesses of his soul, he realized maybe Rosa wasn't the only one who needed saving. The next morning, Alexander arrived at the tower earlier than usual. The city was still waking, fog rolling over the skyline, but his mind had been awake all night. Rosa's words echoed in his head. "I want my life back." Simple, direct, a truth he couldn't shake. For years, Alexander had lived in control of markets, of negotiations, of people. But control meant nothing now. He couldn't control the way Rosa's story gnawed at his conscience, or the way her presence unsettled the walls he had built around his own grief. He buried himself in work, pretending her revelation hadn't cracked him open. Pretending he hadn't spent hours wondering what kind of woman she might have become if the world hadn't caged her. By noon, Rosa was summoned to the executive floor. She expected to be scolded and reminded that boundaries had been crossed. Instead, Alexander handed her a sealed folder. "What's this?" she asked cautiously. "An opportunity. he said, avoiding her eyes. She opened it. Inside was an enrollment packet for a professional language certification program, one of the most prestigious in the country. Tuition, fees, everything paid in full. Her throat tightened. "Why are you doing this?" His answer was sharp, almost defensive. "Because you're too good to waste your life with a mop in your hand." She closed the folder. "And what if I don't want your charity?" His head snapped up, his voice low and tense. "This isn't charity, it's an investment." Her eyes narrowed. "Investment in what? Me? Or your guilt?" The words struck deeper than she intended. His jaw clenched. The air thickened. "Careful, Rosa," he said finally, his tone cold, clipped. "Don't mistake an open door for a chain around your neck." Something inside her broke at that. For a fleeting moment she had believed he saw her not just as a maid, not just as a shadow in the background, but as Rosa, a woman with a story worth telling. But now? He was back to being Alexander Pierce, the billionaire who thought money could erase pain, buy redemption, and solve the unfixable. She pushed the folder back toward him. "Keep your door, Mr. Pierce. I'd rather walk through on my own." The silence that followed was deafening. He looked at her, and for the first time in years, he felt powerless. Completely powerless. Rosa turned on her heel and left, her footsteps echoing down the marble hall. That night, word began to spread in hushed whispers among staff and board members alike. A maid on the executive floor who spoke fluent Japanese, a heated exchange between her and Alexander Pierce. Something was happening, and the world inside the tower was hungry for scandal. When Rosa returned to her quarters, she found an anonymous note slipped under her door. "Be careful. Men like him don't change." Her chest tightened. Whether it came from a jealous employee or a well-meaning friend, the message stung, because part of her feared it was true. Meanwhile, Alexander stood in his penthouse, glass of whiskey untouched in his hand, staring at the city that had once felt like his kingdom. But now the skyline mocked him. Every lit window reminded him of choices he couldn't control. He had tried to fix things with money. It had worked with partners, with rivals, with politicians. But Rosa was different. She didn't want his empire. She wanted her life, and he didn't know how to give it to her. For the first time since his father's death, Alexander Pierce felt like a fraud. Days passed. The silence between them stretched into a canyon. Rosa went back to her duties, but something was different. Her shoulders no longer bent with quiet submission. She carried herself taller, prouder, though her eyes betrayed a storm inside. Alexander buried himself in work, but meetings blurred. Contracts felt meaningless, victories hollow. He had stared down hostile takeovers with less fear than he felt when Rosa walked past him without a glance. The darkest hour had arrived, and neither of them realized they were standing on opposite sides of the same chasm, each waiting for the other to bridge it. But storms don't wait, they break. And the storm that would tear through both their lives was already gathering boardroom whispers sharpening into knives, Rosa's secret past being dragged into the light, and Alexander's own empire trembling under the weight of scandal. They had seen each other's souls, and now the world was about to test whether that connection could survive the fire. The next morning, Rosa woke to the sound of buzzing. Not her alarm, but her phone nonstop vibrations rattling the nightstand. When she finally dared to look, the notifications nearly blinded her. Her name, plastered across headlines. Her face, taken from grainy surveillance photos. Her life, dissected by strangers who knew nothing about her. Mystery woman at Pierce Tower, the hidden cleaning lady who fooled them all. Criminal past. Allegations surface against CEO's companion. From broom to boardroom, or scam of the century. Her hands trembled. She scrolled further and saw old records dragged into the light. The lawsuit she had filed against the factory years ago was dismissed because she couldn't afford the lawyers. The deportation scare that nearly ripped her from her sister. Even a police record from a protest march where she had been arrested and released without charge. Every wound, every scar she thought had healed, was suddenly reopened for the world to poke and prod. At Pierce Tower, whispers became daggers. The staff who once smiled at her now avoided her gaze. A few muttered insults when they thought she couldn't hear. In the break room, someone left a rag and spray bottle on her chair with a note. "Back to work, maid." She stared at it, fury rising in her chest. For years she had endured this kind of cruelty silently, swallowing her pride to keep her job. But now she was tired of silence. She stood, lifted the rag, and dropped it straight into the trash. Then she looked the culprits in the eye. "You think you're safe because you hide behind whispers," she said, her voice low but sharp. "But I've survived worse than your cowardice, and when the truth comes out, you'll remember this moment." Her words left them frozen, their laughter dying in their throats. Rosa walked out, her spine straighter than it had been in years. Alexander's world wasn't faring better. The boardroom had turned into a battlefield. For hours, directors hammered him with accusations. They waved documents, headlines, and angry investor reports like weapons. "Your company is bleeding credibility," one shouted. "Do you want to lose millions because of this woman?" Another leaned in, lips curling. "Or is she blackmailing you, Alexander? Be honest. How else does a maid find herself sitting at the head of your table?" The implication was acid. Alexander's blood boiled. "She's not blackmailing me," he snarled. "She's smarter than any of you in this room, and if you weren't blinded by your arrogance, you'd see that." The room fell into stunned silence, but the damage was done. By defending Rosa so fiercely, he had only made them more determined to see her as a threat. Finally, the chairman spoke, his voice like ice. "You have 48 hours to resolve this, Pierce. Choose her or choose this company, because you cannot have both." The ultimatum rang in Alexander's ears long after the meeting ended. That night, Rosa sat in her room staring at the skyline. She hadn't eaten. She hadn't slept. The city lights blurred through her tears, glowing like cruel stars. A knock at the door startled her. When she opened it, Alexander stood there, tie loosened, eyes hollow, fury barely contained. "They gave me a choice," he said quietly. She already knew. She saw it in his face. Her chest ached, but her voice stayed steady. "Then you don't have a choice at all, do you?" He stepped forward, desperate. "Rosa, I'll fight them. I'll burn this company to the ground before I let them take you from me." Her eyes searched for him, filled with pain. "And what then? When the ashes settle, when the empire you built is gone, what happens to us? Do you really think love can grow in ruins?" His jaw clenched. For the first time in years, Alexander Pierce, the man who never bowed, never broke, looked powerless. And Rosa realized something terrifying. If she stayed, he would destroy everything he had for her, and the world would never let her forget it. The final blow came the next morning. Someone leaked grainy security footage of Rosa in Alexander's office late at night. She was handing him papers, standing close, their heads bent together. The clip was cut, edited to look like something scandalous. The caption spread like wildfire: "CEO's secret lover exposed, corporate espionage or romance." Within hours, the footage was everywhere. Rosa's face, again, splashed across every screen. That was when Rosa snapped. She tore the phone from her hand and hurled it against the wall, glass shattering like her patience. "No more," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No more running, no more hiding. They want to fight?" She straightened, fire blazing in her eyes. "Then I'll give them one." And in that moment, Rosa Delgado ceased being the cleaning lady, the victim, the scapegoat. She became the storm. The storm began with a whisper, and Rosa made sure it roared. By dawn, she had gathered every document, every email, every file she could access about the company's dealings with the factories overseas, the same places where her family's lives had been shattered. She pieced together patterns the board thought no one would ever notice. Exploitation hidden under polished contracts, bribes disguised as community donations, silence bought with blood money. When she finished, she stared at the stack of evidence on her desk. Her hands trembled not with fear, but with fury sharpened into resolve. They want to call me weak, disposable, a maid? Then let them choke on the truth they buried. Her first strike wasn't public. Not yet. She sent the documents anonymously to one of the company's fiercest internal auditors, a man known for loyalty to numbers, not people. If he smelled rot, he would rip it open. The second strike was bolder. She emailed a global human rights watchdog, disguised, encrypted. It was only fragments of the evidence, but enough to spark their interest. And the third strike was against the board itself. That morning, when the directors gathered for another emergency meeting, a sealed envelope awaited each of them. Inside, a single photograph. The image showed the very factory where Rosa's father had been injured, children working under the shadow of machinery far too dangerous for their small hands. The photo was raw, unedited. The caption beneath it was handwritten, her ink sharp and unforgiving. "This is the empire you protect. This is the cost of your silence." Meanwhile, Alexander was pulled in every direction. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. Shareholders, journalists, politicians, all demanding answers, all demanding his compliance. The board circled like vultures. "Distance yourself from her," they insisted. "Make a statement. Deny everything. Save what can still be saved." For hours, Alexander sat in silence at the head of the table, staring at the men and women who claimed to guide his empire. His father's legacy. But when he closed his eyes, all he saw was Rosa standing in his office, refusing to bow. Rosa, who had faced the world's cruelty and still held her head high. Rosa, whose fire burned brighter than the greed of everyone in this room combined. Finally, he spoke. His voice was steel. "You think I'll abandon her to save myself?" He rose from his chair, towering over them. "If you believe that, then you've never understood me at all." The board erupted, voices overlapping in panic and rage. But Alexander walked out, the door slamming behind him like a declaration of war. That night, Rosa and Alexander met in secret, not in his penthouse, not in the tower, but in a small diner tucked away on the city's edge. No cameras, no polished glass walls, just chipped tables and flickering neon. For the first time in days, they sat across from each other without masks. "You shouldn't be here," Rosa whispered, though her heart raced with relief at the sight of him. "I shouldn't be anywhere without you," he replied. Her throat tightened. "They'll destroy you, Alexander. They'll strip you of everything you've built. I don't want to be the reason you lose it all." He leaned forward, his eyes fierce. "Don't you see? You're the reason I finally understand what's worth losing." For a moment, the weight of the world lifted. In that small, fragile space, they weren't billionaires and maids. They were just two souls clinging to each other in the storm. And when his hand covered hers across the table, she didn't pull away. But outside, the storm raged louder. The evidence Rosa had leaked began spreading. The auditors raised alarms, the watchdog hinted at an investigation, and the board struck back harder. Anonymous sources fed the press lies. Rosa was painted as a schemer, a seductress, and an opportunist. Her sister's name was dragged into the mud, her family harassed by reporters. The pressure mounted, suffocating. And then, the board made their most brutal move yet. They called a shareholder vote not only to remove Alexander as CEO, but to prosecute Rosa for corporate theft and sabotage. It was the executioner's blade. When Alexander heard, his fury burned hotter than ever before. "They think they can destroy her to control me?" He spat, pacing his office like a caged beast. "Then I'll bring the whole tower down on their heads." But Rosa stopped him. "No, Alexander, this fight, it's not just about you, or me. It's about everyone they've crushed to build their fortunes. If we're going to win, it has to be the truth that takes them down, not vengeance." Her words stilled him, and for the first time he understood her war was bigger than his empire. The stage was set. The board versus Rosa and Alexander. Lies versus truth, power versus justice. The war within the tower had reached its breaking point, and soon the world would witness the reckoning. The shareholder meeting was meant to be routine. Rows of expensive suits filled the gilded hall, chandeliers glimmering as if mocking the storm about to break. Cameras flashed, reporters whispered, and the board sat at the head table like judges awaiting their verdict. But this time, the accused weren't Rosa and Alexander. This time, the world was watching the empire itself. Rosa stood outside the hall, her hands trembling against the folder she carried. It wasn't just paper anymore. It was a weapon. Inside were the final pieces of evidence: photographs, testimonies, contracts that tied the board directly to exploitation and bribery. It was enough to burn everything to the ground. Beside her, Alexander reached for her hand. "You don't have to do this alone," he murmured, though his eyes burned with pride. "Yes, I do," Rosa replied. "Not just for me, for every family like mine who thought they'd never be heard." And with that, they walked inside together. The board wasted no time. "Mr. Stone," the chairman sneered, voice dripping with false authority, "you've betrayed this company. You've consorted with a—" His eyes flicked to Rosa, filled with contempt, with staff who had no business meddling in matters beyond their station. The audience murmured. Cameras zoomed closer. Alexander didn't flinch. If by betrayal you mean refusing to cover your corruption, then yes, I'm guilty. Gasps filled the room. The chairman slammed his gavel. You're finished here. But before he could continue, Rosa stepped forward. Her voice rang out, clear and steady. No, you are. She opened the folder and laid out the evidence on the table. One by one, the screens lit up with images of child labor in factories, doctored financial reports, and money funneled into offshore accounts. The room went silent except for Rosa's voice, sharp as steel, cutting through every lie they'd built. These are your crimes. These are the people you've destroyed. And today, the world knows the truth. Reporters erupted. Flashbulbs blinded. The shareholders shouted, demanding answers. The board panicked, their polished masks shattering in real time. And then one of them, the youngest director, once loyal, now emboldened, stood and said loudly, "She's right. We've all known, and we stayed silent. Not anymore." It was the crack that broke the dam. The vote turned on its head. Instead of removing Alexander, the shareholders demanded the board's resignation. Investigations were announced on the spot, and the empire, once built on lies, trembled under the weight of truth. The chairman, red with rage, pointed at Rosa. "This is what you're doing. You'll regret this." But Alexander stepped between them, his voice low and dangerous. "The only regret I have is not seeing her worth sooner." The hall roared not with anger, but with applause. Days later, the headlines screamed of justice. Billionaire board toppled in shock revolt. Cleaning lady's testimony sparks global investigation. But behind the noise, there was quiet. A quiet only Rosa and Alexander shared. They stood together on the balcony of his now empty office, the city glittering beneath them. "You burned their empire to the ground," Alexander said softly, almost in awe. Rosa shook her head. "No, we did, but what we build next, that's what matters." He turned to her, the weight of everything in his eyes. "I don't want to build it without you." For a heartbeat, she couldn't breathe. All the walls she had carried, all the pain she had borne, cracked in that moment. And when he leaned in, when his lips finally met hers, it wasn't the kiss of a billionaire and a maid. It was the kiss of two souls who had fought, bled, and risen from the fire together. Weeks later, Rosa visited her family's graveyard. This time, she didn't come alone. Alexander stood beside her, his hand wrapped around hers. "I promised you I'd make them remember," she whispered to the stone where her father's name was carved. "Now they do." Alexander's arm tightened around her, steady, unshakable. And for the first time in years, Rosa felt peace. Not because revenge had been won, but because love had grown from the ashes, stronger than any empire, louder than any boardroom. The story ends with justice served, the corrupt toppled, and Rosa not only as the hero, but as the heart that rebuilt Alexander's life. Their love wasn't an accident. It was the reward for their courage. And so Rosa proved that the world may overlook the quiet, the unseen, the ones they call ordinary, but hidden within them are voices powerful enough to shatter empires. She was never just a cleaning lady. She was justice, the truth, and love. If this story moved you, if it made you reflect on strength, courage, and the power of standing tall against injustice, don't let it end here. Share it. Keep the conversation alive. And if you're new here, subscribe to Unbroken Truths and let the world know the truth may bend, but it never breaks. Because every story deserves to be heard, especially yours. Billionaire was lost without an interpreter until the cleaning lady revealed her hidden talent.